The afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows of Ashford Manor's library, illuminating rows of leather-bound volumes and casting warm, golden light across the Persian carpet. Miss Verity Ashford sat curled into the deep window seat she favored, a slim volume of Tacitus resting open in her hands. Her hazel eyes moved swiftly across the Latin text, translating with practiced ease, her lips forming the words silently as the outside world fell away. At 24, Verity had learned to guard these rare hours of solitude fiercely. They were small sanctuaries stolen from a life increasingly dominated by her mother's anxious calculations that revolved around one pressing concern: marriage. The sudden clatter of hooves shattered the quiet. Verity frowned and glanced toward the window just as an imposing black carriage rolled onto the drive below. It gleamed with wealth and authority, drawn by two magnificent horses and bearing an unfamiliar crest. This was no casual visitor. Unease stirred in her chest as the carriage came to a halt before the front steps, the coachman's immaculate livery signaling rank far beyond Ashford Manor's modest standing. Whatever had arrived at their door would not be easily ignored. Moments later, her mother's voice rang sharply through the house. "Verity, Verity Ashford, where are you?" The tone carried unmistakable panic. Lady Ashford burst into the library, cheeks flushed, eyes bright with a dangerous mix of excitement and alarm. Her gaze fell instantly on Verity and on the open book in her hands. "Good heavens," she exclaimed, snatching it away. "Latin again? At a time like this?" "I was only reading, Mamma," Verity replied, rising calmly. "Surely." "There is no surely about it," Lady Ashford snapped. "The Earl of Blackstone has arrived without warning." The name struck like a bell. Even Verity, who largely ignored society gossip, knew of him. Lord Julian Winters, Earl of Blackstone. Immensely wealthy, politically formidable, and notoriously exacting. A man whose favor could elevate families or quietly ruin them. "Why would such a man come here?" Verity asked, genuinely bewildered. "He requires your father's counsel on an urgent parliamentary matter," her mother said, wringing her hands. "But that is irrelevant. What matters is that you must go to your room at once and remain there. Do you hear me?" Verity stared. "You wish me to hide?" "I wish to save you from permanent disgrace," Lady Ashford said fiercely. "The Earl is unmarried. Unmarried and powerful. Lydia is here with her friends, polished, accomplished young ladies. I will not have you parading your peculiarities before him and convincing him our family raises unfeminine bluestockings." The words stung, though Verity recognized the fear beneath them. She inclined her head. "Very well, Mamma. I shall make myself scarce." Yet even as she turned away, fate had already begun rearranging her carefully ordered world, drawing her, step by reluctant step, toward the one man who would see precisely what others had tried so hard to hide. Verity's attempt at seclusion proved short-lived. Barely half an hour had passed before a discreet knock sounded at her door, followed by the apologetic face of Mrs. Patterson, the housekeeper, bearing news of domestic emergencies that could not wait. The cook required immediate guidance regarding an unplanned formal dinner, merchants had delivered bills needing approval, and the household's delicate budget could not withstand careless decisions. With a quiet sigh, Verity set aside obedience in favor of responsibility. While her mother orchestrated social strategy and her father debated matters of state, it was Verity who ensured Ashford Manor functioned at all. She moved swiftly through the servants' corridors, conferring, advising, correcting, her presence calm and authoritative. The staff deferred to her instinctively. They knew who truly kept the household afloat. As she passed near the drawing room, muffled voices reached her ears. Male tones, measured and deliberate, carried the weight of governance. Lighter laughter followed. Lydia and her friends, no doubt, deployed precisely as intended. Verity continued on, rolling her eyes when she overheard her mother's whispered instructions, smiles, agreement, and silence on any topic of substance. Charm without challenge. The irony was not lost on her. She had just retrieved the needed ledger from the library shelf when the door burst open without warning. Sir Geoffrey Ashford stood there, visibly agitated. "Verity, thank heavens," he exclaimed. "I need you immediately." "Mamma expressly forbade," she began. "Nonsense," her father interrupted, already taking her arm. "This is urgent. The Earl and I are at an impasse. A clause in the treaty, archaic phrasing, devilishly ambiguous. Tomorrow's vote hinges upon its interpretation. You are the only person I trust to resolve it." Before she could protest further, she found herself propelled toward the drawing room and directly into the very situation she had been ordered to avoid. The room fell silent upon her entrance. At the far end stood the Earl of Blackstone, tall and commanding, his riding attire immaculate, his presence unmistakably authoritative. Dark hair brushed with silver framed a face shaped by discipline and control. Documents lay scattered beside him, evidence of prolonged debate. Lady Ashford sat rigidly on the settee beside Lydia and her companions, their expressions frozen in collective disbelief. "My lord," Sir Geoffrey announced proudly, "may I present my eldest daughter, Miss Verity Ashford. Her linguistic expertise has aided my work for years." The Earl turned, his pale gray eyes fixing on Verity with a penetrating calm that set her pulse racing. She executed a proper curtsy, acutely aware of her plain dress and unadorned hair. "Miss Ashford," he said, voice deep and steady, "your father speaks highly of you." There was no mockery in his tone, only interest. When the treaty was placed before her, Verity focused solely on the text, shutting out the weight of scrutiny. She analyzed structure, tone, precedent. When she spoke, it was with careful confidence, explaining not only what the clause said, but what it intended. The Earl listened intently. Then he challenged her. Not dismissively, but intelligently. What followed was not an interrogation, but a duel of minds. Their exchange grew animated, precise, absorbing. Verity defended her interpretation with logic and historical awareness. The Earl countered with equal rigor. Slowly, skepticism gave way to consideration, and finally, acceptance. "Your reasoning is sound," the Earl said at last. "Impressive." In that moment, something shifted, not merely in the room, but in Verity herself. For the first time, she was not being indulged, tolerated, or silenced. She was being seen. What began as a single intellectual exchange became the foundation of something far more dangerous and far more exhilarating. The Earl of Blackstone departed Ashford Manor that evening with formal courtesy, yet his eyes lingered on Verity in a way that did not escape notice. Nor did it escape Lady Ashford's increasingly sharp calculations. Within days, the Earl returned. Then again. Always with legitimate business for Sir Geoffrey, yet always timing his visits with uncanny precision, arriving when Verity was present, lingering when she spoke, listening with unmistakable intent. Their conversations expanded beyond treaties and politics. They spoke of history and philosophy, of poetry and reform, of the obligations borne by those born to privilege. The Earl did not flatter Verity, nor attempt to charm her with empty gallantry. Instead, he questioned her opinions, pressed her reasoning, and challenged her conclusions. When she argued well, he acknowledged it openly. When she faltered, he waited patiently for her to recover. It was an exchange of equals, something Verity had scarcely dared to imagine could exist. Lady Ashford attempted repeatedly to redirect his attention. Lydia and her friends were paraded before him with practiced smiles and delicate laughter, yet his interest waned visibly in their presence. He responded with courtesy, but his gaze drifted, always back to Verity. Finally, after enduring an excruciating quarter-hour of conversation about fashion and London gossip, he turned deliberately toward her. "Miss Ashford," he said, "you mentioned earlier an opinion regarding Wordsworth's recent work. I confess I found the collection rather disappointing. I should like to hear your thoughts." The room froze. Verity met her mother's horrified gaze before answering honestly. Their ensuing debate was spirited, incisive, and utterly improper by society's standards. They disagreed openly, even playfully, and the Earl laughed, genuinely laughed, when Verity accused him of defending sentimental excess. By the time he took his leave, he had secured an invitation to dine that very evening. Dinner proved transformative. Removed from the artificial stiffness of formal calls, Julian, he insisted she call him that in private, revealed warmth beneath his controlled exterior. He spoke of his youth, of the burdens of leadership, of the isolation that accompanied his title. Verity, emboldened by his openness, spoke freely in return. When he requested permission to call again the following day, his intention was unmistakable. Weeks passed in a pattern that would have been unthinkable before his arrival. Their attachment deepened quietly, though not without scrutiny. Society noticed. Whispers followed. Some regarded Verity with envy, others with suspicion. Julian, for his part, remained unwavering, attentive, protective, and increasingly vulnerable. Yet there were shadows he would not discuss. Mentions of his family prompted careful deflections, his voice cooling. Whenever conversations strayed too close to personal loss, the truth emerged only after Verity pressed gently and sought understanding from her father. The revelation was devastating. Julian had inherited his title at 21, following his father's murder at the hands of a trusted associate. The scandal that followed had been public and merciless. Worse still, the estate had been nearly ruined by hidden debts. Julian had rebuilt everything alone, forging discipline from grief and control from chaos. When Verity confronted him, his composure finally fractured. Anger, shame, and grief spilled forth in raw confession. She listened without judgment, offering not solutions, but acceptance. When she told him his anger did not make him cruel, that grief did not diminish his worth, something within him broke free. Their first kiss followed not passion, but truth. "I love you," he admitted, voice unsteady. "And I am terrified of losing you." "I love you too," Verity answered, understanding in that moment that their bond had moved beyond courtship into something irrevocable. Love, once acknowledged, did not soften the world's sharp edges. If anything, it sharpened them. The announcement of the Earl of Blackstone's courtship of Miss Verity Ashford spread swiftly through society, igniting curiosity, disbelief, and resentment in equal measure. Invitations once withheld arrived suddenly. Smiles that had never been offered before appeared polished and eager. Yet beneath the civility lay judgment, measuring glances and whispered doubts that followed Verity wherever she went. The most formidable test came at a tea hosted by the Duchess of Waverley, a woman renowned for her influence and her cruelty disguised as refinement. From the moment Verity arrived, she sensed the purpose of the gathering. The Duchess questioned her with elegant precision, her family, her education, her fortune, each inquiry framed as polite interest but weighted with assessment. When the Duchess observed that the Earl of Blackstone could have chosen far more advantageous alliances, the implication was unmistakable. Verity replied calmly that character mattered more to her than title. The Duchess smiled thinly, reminding her that love was a luxury few in their position could afford. The doubts lingered long after the tea concluded. Was Verity truly suited to Julian's world? Could affection alone withstand expectations built over centuries? Julian's reassurance that evening was firm and unwavering. He dismissed the Duchess's judgment as bitterness disguised as duty and declared his refusal to sacrifice happiness for hollow approval. Yet even his confidence could not entirely quiet the unease planted by her words. Then the scandal broke. A notorious gossip sheet published a vicious article dissecting Verity's family with surgical cruelty. Distant relations were dragged into public scrutiny, past indiscretions exaggerated into disgrace. Verity herself was portrayed as an ambitious interloper, scheming, calculating, and utterly unworthy of the Earl's regard. The accusations cut deeply, echoing fears she had never voiced aloud. She wept alone, wondering if loving Julian had condemned him to ridicule. Julian's reaction was not one of gentle consolation, but of cold fury. He did not engage publicly, nor did he allow the lies to stand unchallenged. Instead, he moved decisively behind closed doors, calling in debts, exerting influence, and making it unmistakably clear that further attacks would bring financial and social ruin. The silence that followed was immediate and absolute. Verity learned then what it meant to be chosen, not merely admired, but defended. Their engagement was announced soon after at a grand ball at Blackstone Hall. The estate itself was breathtaking, ancient stone glowing in candlelight, generations of power embedded in every archway. Julian remained at her side, anchoring her as they faced a tide of reactions. Some offered genuine
joy,
others thin smiles and veiled contempt. Verity bore it all with quiet dignity, though exhaustion crept beneath her composure. Seeking refuge on the terrace, she encountered Julian's sister, Lady Charlotte Winters. With gentle pragmatism, Charlotte offered counsel born of experience. Society could not be conquered, only navigated. Armor would come with time. Allies would reveal themselves. What mattered most was remembering why she had chosen this life, and whom she had chosen it with. The weeks that followed demanded growth from them both. Verity stumbled at times, speaking too freely on matters that stirred political unease. Julian, in turn, struggled to reconcile love with responsibility. Their first true argument was painful but necessary, exposing fears of change and loss of self. By dawn, they reached understanding, not perfection but partnership. They agreed to learn together, to compromise without surrendering integrity. When winter arrived, Verity had found her footing. She forged alliances, championed causes with quiet effectiveness, and learned when silence carried more power than speech. Julian, freed from isolation, softened visibly. Together, they built not a performance of duty, but a shared life grounded in respect. The wedding took place on a bright December morning, candles glowing against winter stone. As Verity walked toward Julian, she saw not an earl defined by rank, but a man who had chosen her fully, and whom she chose in return. The weeks following their wedding unfolded with a quiet intimacy that neither had known before. Removed from the constant scrutiny of society, Julian and Verity retreated briefly to a secluded hunting lodge on the Blackstone estate, where the world seemed to slow and soften. There, without titles or expectations pressing in from every side, they learned one another in the most essential ways. They spoke late into the night beside crackling fires, debating philosophy one moment and laughing at trivial absurdities the next. They walked frost-laced paths in companionable silence, finding comfort not in constant conversation, but in shared presence. For the first time in his adult life, Julian allowed himself to rest. It was in those days that they established the foundations that would sustain them long after the novelty of romance faded. They spoke frankly of fears and ambitions, of mistakes they would inevitably make, and of the kind of marriage they wished to build, one rooted in mutual respect rather than rigid performance. Verity made it clear that she would never abandon her convictions, and Julian vowed never to demand such a sacrifice. In return, she accepted the realities of his position, understanding that discretion and timing were not betrayals of principle, but tools for survival within a demanding world. They chose partnership deliberately, promising honesty even when it was uncomfortable. Their return to society was not without challenge. Judgment lingered, and whispers did not vanish overnight. Yet something had changed. Verity no longer faced scrutiny alone. She moved through ballrooms and drawing rooms with a quiet assurance, guided by an inner certainty that did not depend on approval. Julian, once rigid with control, now smiled more easily, his laughter no longer rare. Those who mattered saw the difference. Those who did not soon found themselves irrelevant. Christmas arrived with heavy snowfall, transforming Blackstone Hall into a vision of stillness and light. Verity stood at the tall library window one evening, watching flakes drift downward, the world outside hushed and white. A year earlier, she had believed herself destined for a narrow life. Intellect hidden, expectations modest, solitude accepted as the price of authenticity. Now she stood as Countess of Blackstone, mistress of a vast estate, her future uncertain yet rich with possibility. Julian joined her quietly, slipping his arms around her waist, resting his chin against her shoulder. The warmth of him was familiar, grounding. When he asked what occupied her thoughts, she answered honestly that she was marveling at how completely everything had changed and how none of it felt like regret. He asked, with uncharacteristic vulnerability, if she was truly happy. Verity turned to face him, meeting his gaze without hesitation. She told him that happiness, she had learned, was not found in titles or comfort, but in being fully known and fully accepted. In him, she had found a partner who valued her mind, her voice, her whole self. That, she said, was the truest fortune she could imagine. Julian kissed her then, not with urgency, but with reverence. In that quiet moment, as winter settled around them, they stood not as symbols of rank or duty, but as two people who had chosen one another deliberately, bravely, and without apology, ready to face whatever years might bring, side by side.